I was never leaving the faith. I knew too much about the Lord to leave the faith. So I was going to continue to be a Christian. I was going to continue to love the Lord and know who he was. But what had shifted was trusting him. Something that I like to say often is that I have been saved since the womb. My parents, I was raised in church, went to church my entire life. But the time that I can actually remember being saved, I was 8 years old, living in California. And we were watching a production of Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames. And so it's this big production where they have like all these people's lives. And some people are loving the Lord and praising the Lord. And then you see them die. And then they go to heaven and they're in front of the pearly gates. And Jesus is like, welcome. And then you see the people who weren't living for the Lord. And then they die. And then the enemy comes out. And he's like, you're coming with me. And I saw that at 8 years old. And I was like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. So at the end, they said, who would like to give their life to the Lord? And that was the time that I can actually remember raising my hand and saying, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. We're going to go with the Lord. And so I raised my hand and I went down to the front and I accepted the Lord at 8 years old. And ever since then, I have been walking with the Lord since I was 8 years old. I got baptized at 10 years old. And I remember distinctly, it was at the same church in California. And my dad asked me, he said, Ciara, why do you want to get baptized? And I remember sitting there and I remember saying, because I got saved and I know who Jesus is and I know what it means to go under the water old and come up new and come up cleansed. And I want to do that. And I want to live my life for Jesus. And my dad even looked at me and was super impressed because he was like, you're 10. And I was expecting, I don't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't that. And so he was like, okay. And so I went up in front of the church and I got baptized and I have been walking with the Lord ever since. I didn't really have a backsliding season. I didn't have a partying season. I didn't really even have a season when I wasn't close to the Lord. I was super connected, super involved in church my entire life. When I was younger, everyone would always say, Ciara's going to end up working at a church. Ciara's going to be a pastor. Ciara's going to marry someone in the church. It's just been my entire story. I've loved it and I've always loved it. And in 2006, I graduated high school. And I was about to go to school, about to go to college in Colorado. And my mom called like a family meeting and we all went up to Denver for a family trip. And didn't think anything of it. We're like, okay, let's go. And we go up to Denver and we went there because Denver has one of the top lung specialist doctors in the world in Denver. And so I was like, okay, so we go. And our whole family is sitting in the waiting room. And then he comes and he tells my mom that they found a malignant tumor in her lung. And so she had cancer. And I remember in that moment, my world it got like a tunnel. It closed in. And everything that I had known my entire life really just in 2 seconds shifted. And I was like, okay. I don't even fully know what this means, but okay. And I was 18 at the time. And at that moment specifically, didn't cause me to think anything different, didn't cause me to do anything differently. I was just like, okay. My mother is a woman of faith. Her faith was contagious. Any person that knows her, talked to her, spoke to her in her entire life, faith exudes from her pores. And so that was the very thing that I attached to. So I was like, okay, let's go. My mom's countenance was up. She was ready. So I was like, okay. And I remember even on the drive home from Denver to Colorado Springs, which is about an hour drive, I remember that entire drive, my mom was calling many of her friends and she was like, this is what they said, but I know who the Lord is. This is what they said, but my God's got it. My God's the healer. Just faith. And so I was picking up on that. And even at 18, I'm listening and I'm like, okay, this is the stance that we're going to take as a family. So I was like, all right, I got it. Let's go. I know who the Lord is. I know what the word says. We got it. And so 2006, she was diagnosed. And then in 2013, she went into remission. She was healed. I remember getting the phone call. I still lived in Colorado. My family lived in Georgia at that time. And I remember it was around Thanksgiving and I got the phone call and my mom was like, guess what? Cancer free. And I Oh my gosh, I was in a Chick-fil-A. I will never forget. I was sitting inside a Chick-fil-A with one of my best friends at the time, and I was like, this is crazy. And I lost it, and I was crying, and I was like, God, you're so good. You are so amazing. You're the healer. I mean, gosh, even sitting now, could just feel that. And so we were good. So from 2013 until 2015, life was great. We were fine. We were living life. Like, future was bright. It was amazing. And then December of 2015, when I got home, I saw her, and she didn't look like herself. And I remember having a conversation with her. We were sitting by the refrigerator, and she started slurring her speech. And she mentioned how her legs were numb. And I was like, okay, that's not, what is that? That's not normal. So I was like, okay, Mom, we need to get you to a doctor. My mindset was just like, okay, this is clearly not normal, but let's get you to the doctor. And so New Year's comes, and I'm back at my apartment. And I remember I was cooking dinner, and I had called her earlier that morning, and I asked her how to cook. I think I was cooking collard greens, and I asked her something that she put in it. And so she was telling me, and then I was cooking, and I was getting ready to go to Saturday night service that Saturday. And then this was probably 4 or 5 hours after I had called her for that ingredient. My dad calls me, and he's like, hey, Mom had just had a seizure, and we're rushing to the hospital, so I need you to come. And I was like, oh my gosh, what in the world? So shut everything down, and I diverted. I didn't go to church. I went to the hospital, and I see her lying in the bed there. And I was like, what's going on? And the doctors at that time came and said that they thought it was a stroke. So I was like, okay, a stroke's not great, but a stroke we can handle. We can handle the stroke. A stroke is fine. So again, didn't think inhibitions were low. I was like, oh, we're fine. It's a stroke. It's good. We leave. She had to stay overnight, but then they weren't releasing her from the hospital. And I was like, okay, what's happening? So I'm calling my dad, I'm calling my mom. I'm like, what's happening? Something's off. Why isn't she being released from the hospital? And so she was there for 3 days, and they finally released her from the hospital. So I was like, okay, nice. Now we can start this process. We can start working on it. We can see what physical therapy needs to happen with the stroke. We can do all those things. And, but we weren't getting the information needed, or at least I wasn't getting the information needed to know what was going on. And 3 days after that, she had another seizure. My dad called me, and she had another one and had to go back to the hospital. And at that point, she goes back to the hospital, and now there's some questions arising. I'm like, what in the world is going on? And at the time, I was we'll use the word denial. I was going to say naive, but I wasn't naive. I was in denial of what was happening. And my mom was still the same person in the sense of faith and what that looked like. And so I was like, that's what we're holding on to. I'm holding on to it. I read every scripture known to man on faith. I prayed every prayer that you could possibly pray. I was like, God, I know that you got this. You are the healer, and we're going to do this. It was really hard for me to be in the room with her. The mom that I had known and the mom that I had always been with, she was different. And so being in the room with her and everyone else was really hard for me because it was a lot of pain in the room. And I, at the time, did not deal with pain very well. And so I was like, your girl can't be in here. I'm just going to go pray. I'm going to go to my closet and I'm going to pray. And so then there was one specific night where our family, my dad, myself, and my sister took turns staying the night with her. Just number one, so we could be with her. But number two, we had to monitor some things that were going on with her. And so it was my night to be in there with her. And me and my mom had such a special relationship. And I was in the room with her, and I looked at her and I said, Mom, do you want me to fight? Do you, what's happening? Because this is not the mom that I know, the faith and the fighting. Do you want me to fight? And she looked at me and she said, yes. And I said, all right, I got you. I got you. We will be how we've always been. And so I go back into that same mode, and I'm fighting, and I am praying. And I remember leaving that night, and I go home, and she's still in the hospital. And so I go, and at that point, I'm looking up different things on hospice care. I'm looking up different things on people who have recovered, like people who have lived this life and then they've gotten sent to hospice, but they've recovered and they're miracles. And so I'm like in this zone. And I go home, and my dad comes into my old room in our house, and he tells me, hey, I have something to tell you, see. And I was like, I didn't want to hear it. And he said the cancer came back, and it metastasized to her brain, and they gave her 2 weeks to live. And the thought of what that looks like, the thought of what that is. I was like, there's no way. There's no way. And so again, I went into this mode. I went into this war room and this closet, and I was like, this is not going to happen. And then January 30th of 2016, my sister calls me at 1:36 in the morning, and I knew exactly what that phone call was. And my mom had passed away. She told me mom was gone. And I remember laying in my bed, and I wasn't at the house at that time. I went back home to my apartment, and my dad and my sister were at home. And I laid in the bed and I was numb. There were no tears. There was nothing happening. And I just sat there. There was nothing that could come out of my mouth, nothing. And I was just like, okay. And my sister asked me to come to the house, and I said no. And then my dad calls me like 3 minutes later, and he's like, hey, C, we need you here. And I was like, why? And that, at the time I was like, okay, Ciara, that was bold because you said that to your dad, and that was serious. But it was obviously had grace. He had grace for me in that moment. And he was like, see, we need you here. And I was like, fine. So I get up, I drive to my parents' house, which was about maybe 10 minutes. And I get into the house, and that was brutal. That was brutal. My mom, they had set up her room in our front office room. We'd made it a room for her. And she was lying there lifeless, and tears galore. My uncle was there. I never heard the guttural tears that I heard from him. My dad is laying in his mom's lap, sobbing. My sister's having a full-blown anxiety attack, has to be taken to the urgent care emergency room because she cannot breathe. Our dog at the time is freaking out because they clearly know something's going on. He's freaking out, and it was pure chaos. And I was like, what is happening? And I go into our living room and I sit on the couch, and I'm just there. And one of my aunts comes over and she says, do you want to go say goodbye to your mom? And I said, she's not there. She's already gone. And she told me, I think you would regret it if you didn't. And I honestly don't know if that's the truth, but I went in. I did. I went in. I kissed her on her forehead, and I said, Mom, I love you, and I'll see you again. I'll see you soon. And went back into the living room and then waited for them to come and get her. And I remember I had this thought. I said, God, I was like, what if they missed it? Like, what if they're wrong? What if she just breathes all of a sudden really quick and life comes back into her? I want to make sure that that they're aware, that they know in case that happens. And that, of course, didn't happen. And so they wheeled her out, and she was gone. And I was like, wow. And at that moment and at that time, I was like, what in the world am I supposed to do? And so my first thought was, I was on the schedule, so I lead worship, and I was on the schedule that weekend to sing, and I called the worship pastor, and I was like, hey, so my mom just passed away, and so I'm not going to be able to sing tonight, but I can still sing tomorrow. And he literally was like, first of all, you're not singing. And second of all, what can we do? What do you need? And it kind of snapped me into the reality of like, oh, wow. Okay, Ciara, maybe you're not well. Maybe you're not okay. So, we finish that up. We have her service, we do all those things. And then I get right back to normal Ciara, normal life. It took me 3 weeks to actually cry. I remember, I didn't really shed a tear. I was super numb, super still myself, very bubbly, but everyone around me knew Ciara's not good. And at my church, we have this massive cross in our main campus parking lot. And I worked at my church at the time, and I go back to that parking lot when I started working again. And I went up to the cross, and I just broke, sobbed. And I was like, God, and I knew that once I let that cry out, I was going to feel every ounce of what I was trying not to feel for so long. I just couldn't hold it anymore. And that pain was brutal. And I was like, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go from here. And so after that moment, it took me about 2 years of not thinking about it, not dealing with it, not processing any of it. I just went full force into my work, serving, leading worship, being there for people, school, studying. I'm a therapist, and so I put everything into that. And I was like, okay, this is what we're gonna do. And the biggest piece of those 2 years was I was never leaving the faith. I knew too much about the Lord to leave the faith. So I was going to continue to be a Christian. I was going to continue to love the Lord and know who he was. But what had shifted was trusting him. I was like, yeah, that. Yeah. I was like, Lord, we're cool. Like, we're good. I was like, I know too much. You're not going to hell. That's too much. So I'm going to do this. But yeah, me and you and trusting isn't really gonna really be a thing. It was probably in those 2 years of not trusting him where I really took on everything myself. So the scripture in the Bible, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. For my burden is easy and my yoke is light. Yeah, your girl wasn't resting. She took on everything. So Sabbaths weren't really happening. Honestly, praying really wasn't happening because at the time I prayed with every ounce of my soul for her to be healed. And the understanding of what I had of healing then, for the Lord to not come through that way, in the way in which I thought he should at that time. I mean, it jacked me up. It destroyed me in the moment. And so I was like, what are we even doing? Like, what is this? Lord, what is this for? Why do we even pray? Like, your word says pray without ceasing, but why? I mean, your girl had all the questions and was not well. And so in that, I was just like, okay, no, I'm just going to figure it out. And I went to the Lord for super surface things, like things that I knew, provision, or a roof over my head, things like that. Okay. But the deep seated desires, the deep seated places of my heart that essentially I would need to like give over to him or bring him in on, or that intimacy space with him. I didn't trust him with those pieces of my heart. I didn't trust that he was going to take them and hold them or care for them. And so I was like, oh, I'm not about to give those to you. Not trusting him basically turned me into a super control freak. I had to be 77 steps ahead. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to be ready to go. I had to know the answer. And if I didn't, then we're not doing it. Like, very, very controlling. My goodness. And yeah, control at the nth degree, but it was also meant me holding every single thing that was near and dear to me and not releasing it. So my hand wasn't open. It was super tight and I held it very, very close. And so for 2 years, that's how I operated. You'd see me leading worship. You'd see me up there. I know how to do the gestures. I know how to lead worship. I know how to do those things. So I was like, well, we'll get through it. I was on a mission trip in 2018, and I was leading that missions trip, and it was a massive team. And one day while leading the missions trip, I ended up having, I passed out. Basically, I was super dehydrated. I wasn't really eating enough. The heat index is insane in Nicaragua. And we were doing an activity and it just got to be too much for my body and I collapsed. And they had to take me into a cot in the little nurses station in Nicaragua. And so I was probably out and asleep. I had come to, and then I was asleep for about 2 hours. And in that moment, the Lord said so clearly to me, he said, hey, Ciara, I need you to deal with this pain, because if you don't, you're going to end up just like your mom. And that sobered me up real quick. And I was like, whoa. I was like, okay. And so I get back from the missions trip, I go to church, I talk to some leaders there that I trusted, and I was like, hey, this is what's going on. I have no idea what this is going to look like. I don't even really want to do this, but one thing that I have always been, and I like to believe that I am, is obedient, even when I hate it. And I was like, so I'm going to be obedient, but I'm not sure what's going to happen with it. And so they got me set up at the time with a therapist and a grief counselor who was going to walk me through some stuff. And we began the journey of dealing with this pain and of healing. And within the midst of that too, I was in a relationship, and the Lord used that relationship, and it ended fine and all those things, but he used it even more so in this area, because it was during those 2 years that I was holding so tightly. And I was like, God, I am terrified to give you anything of value to me, because in my mind, I don't know if you care about it. And so he used that relationship to show me some things. It was painful. It was very painful. It hurt a lot, but the refining happened within that as well. And I was learning to release the control. I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about how I saw the Lord. I learned that even though since I was 8 until my mom passed when I was 27, from 8 until 27, almost 20 years, I knew the Lord. I walked with him, but there was such a deeper layer of my goodness, understanding, knowing his character, knowing his heart. There was such a deeper level that I didn't have. No fault of anyone's. I just didn't really have it. I kind of saw it one way. I was maybe a little bit on the legalistic side, a little bit on the self-righteous side in some areas, or the right against wrong and that kind of thing. And so the Lord really stripped all of that down to show me his heartbeat for his people, his heartbeat for, the world, his heartbeat and his heartbreak when our heart breaks. And I spent the next, 2 years diligently really processing some stuff where my mom was concerned. I can remember specifically a moment in that 2-year period where I was struggling. And so on the outside, I'm going through the motions, living life, doing things. I don't know that my closest friends would be able to tell, but I'm not sure if people on the outside would really be able to tell what I was going through. But internally, I was unwell. And I remember specifically, I was renting a room from someone. My dad had just sold our house. And that was very, very difficult, because that was the last house I had with my mom in it. So he had just sold it. And my sister got married, and she moved with her husband at the time. And so it was just me, and I felt very, very alone. And it was in those moments typically where I was hurting the most, because my mother was she was the glue for me. Her and I, something in the counseling world is called a dyad. And so her and I were like that dyad. It was the two of us, and it was us against the world. And so in that moment, I was by myself. I was in the room I was renting, and I was sitting in a dark room, lights off. And I was sitting on the side of my bed, and I was crying. And I was crying to the point of the pain had reached a level of unbearable at that moment. And I was sitting there, and I was like, what is the point? What is the point of all of this? I don't understand. And I again, the contrast in my brain, it's like I know what I know the word, but the head knowledge and the heart knowledge are so different. And so my head knows what the Bible says, but at the time my heart did not care what the Bible said. My heart was hurting. My heart was in agony. And I was sitting there missing my mom. It was so recent at that point. And I am sobbing, and I curl up on the side, and I'm in the fetal position, breaking in the dark. And I am just like, God, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it through this. I don't know. I don't. This, how does anyone get through something this unbearable unscathed? Like, how do they do that? And I laid there, and I just cried for probably, oh my gosh, 2 hours probably. Um, just sitting in that pain, sitting in that hurt, and the disbelief probably still at that time. And yeah, and I didn't want to call anyone. I didn't want to bring anyone into it. I just kind of wanted to sulk a little bit. I wanted to just sit in it. And it was it was hard. It was hard. And I think the hardest part too was not just getting an answer to quote unquote rescue you in the moment. I don't feel there wasn't an epiphany. He didn't come down and shine a light and make the light glow in the room. And I'm like, God, yes. No, it was like, no, you're going to sit here and you're going to cry and you're going to feel every ounce of this pain. And you're going to still sit in it and you're still going to feel it. And you're going to feel it a little bit more. And I was kicking and screaming. I felt like a 3-year-old just throwing a tantrum because I was so angry. I was so angry. I was like, you can fix it. Just fix it. He didn't in that moment. He just kind of let me sit there and cry. And I sat there and I cried. I then walked the journey of realizing I don't deal with pain very well. And the Lord putting so much more levels of pain in my path for me to now see how are we going to walk this out while still processing and dealing with my mom. So it was brutal. It was so hard. And I had many moments where I wanted to give up, many moments where I was like, this is for the birds. I was like, Lord, no, I'm not doing it. I don't want to, and then I would pick myself up. I'd have people around me that would come alongside. And I'd be like, all right, here we go. What are we going to do today? What are we going to do today? And so I just walked this out. And in the midst of that journey, the Lord was removing my dependency from my mom to him. And I started realizing that for my whole entire life, I saw my mom as my rock. I saw my mom as my constant. I saw my mom as all of these things that a mother is. So it's not to say that she wasn't those things. She was. But the Lord was now shifting me to realize that he gave her the very love that she had for me. And so as much as she loved me, how much more did he love me? And so it was just this shifting of like, yes, my dependency was on my mom in the way that a child should depend on their mother. But because the Lord has created that, I can depend on him so much more. And so it took a long time for me to get there and understand it. But as he was shifting me there and as he was moving me there, I dealt with other things with my family. So what the enemy tried to do was come in and now tell me that everybody I loved was going to die. So now I'm taking on everyone's hurt and everyone's pain because I was like, well, I didn't deal with my pain and it was really, really hard. So now let me take on everyone else's pain because that's smart. And so I'm like, okay. So my sister, she went through a really, really, really hard marriage, a tumultuous marriage, and she almost did not make it out of that. And she had 2 suicide attempts during this. And I was trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do here? And Lord, how do I lean on you here? But I was failing miserably. And it was a lot of pressure I felt that I put on myself, but so much pressure. And then my dad, he got remarried, and that has been a journey with his new wife and just realizing, how do we navigate this? What does that look like? How do we do this? And that was tough at times. And I just was like, God, what in the world? What are we doing? What am I doing? What are we doing? And so through all of that, through the constant prayer, the constant obedience, the constant relearning of trust, the Lord has now put me in a position where I can now give back to others the very way that he gave to me, and then pointing them back to him, of course, because he is the only one that can actually bring anyone through this. And so with my degree in counseling and psychology and being a therapist, I specialize in trauma. And so now anyone that comes, that we're attacking trauma, whether it's childhood trauma, whether it's today trauma, trauma that they're in right now, PTSD, any type of trauma, we're going to attack and we're going to go after. And there's a biblical lens that I will bring to it. And so, of course, we're always constantly going back to the word. We're constantly going back to maybe where their knowledge of the Lord is maybe a little bit broken, a little bit shifted. Then I always want to try to point them back to him and his character to them so that they can see and know his heart is always for them and has always been for them. But let's see what pain might be there that we can work through. And out of that as well birthed my nonprofit that I have. It's called After the Father's Heart. And it's designed for people to be able to come to process their pain. Because in my journey of realizing almost 9 years now that there was no pain that I had processed. Even before my mom passed, realizing that I would take things on and I would just stuff them. And so her passing awakened all of that. So I dealt with hers, but then I dealt with so many other things as well. And so the retreat is designed for men and women to come to and just deal with that, to see what the Lord might be saying to them right now, what the Lord might be wanting to say to them right now. And the reason it's a nonprofit and not a for-profit specifically in this arena is because I don't ever want money to be a reason why somebody doesn't come to deal with pain. I don't want money to be a hindrance to why someone can't do it. And also, not even for maybe the less fortunate or maybe for ones that can't afford something like that. It's also for people who absolutely can't afford it, but they're not thinking about that. They're not thinking about their pain. They're not thinking about what's going on. So I want to remove that hindrance from them as well. And hey, this is free. You don't have to pay for it. Just spend a couple days and let's see what the Lord wants to do. And so that has been incredible to see the girls come through and just become self-abandoned in front of the Lord. And I am blown away every single time it happens. I'm like, Lord, I'm going to go and I don't know what's going to happen, but you're going to use me and we're going to do it. And then just to see what comes out of it is incredible. And so I've done that. And then next year, I have a book coming out and that's something I'm very excited about, but it's called Choose Your Hard. And it's literally roads that lead from bondage to freedom. And so it's my journey, it's my story, but it's talking about there are two roads that we can choose. One road seems like it's the better road, whether we don't forgive, whether we choose not to whether we choose not to forgive, whether we choose to go through a sanctification process with the Lord, whether in our singleness and marriage, what does that look like? Freedom, even. It's like we think one way, but if we choose to do it the Lord's way, it can lead to a life, an abundant life of just freedom and joy. And so that is what I have been able to pour myself into after years and years of processing what that looks like. And any way that I can, I want to be able to hopefully shed some light and help people understand that their pain is valid, but with the Lord with them, they can get through it. If you're struggling to trust God after the loss of a loved one, grief, loss of a job, anything like that, my advice would be to lean into His word, lean into who He is, and don't be afraid to bring the hard questions to Him. I think so often we get to this point, especially knowing how I was raised, where it's almost like we shouldn't have doubts. We shouldn't question. We shouldn't ask questions, or we're not allowed to feel pain. And if we do, then, oh my goodness, we're doing something wrong. Or if there's suffering happening, or if I feel anything less than joyful, then something's wrong. And I would invite you to challenge that. Lean into it and bring the very raw emotion to Him. Let Him know, God, I don't trust you right now. I don't trust you in this area. And allow Him to show you who He is, because He's faithful to do it. And I would say have your heart open to what He says, to what He has to say about it. But don't be afraid to let Him know where you're at and what you really feel, and let Him meet you there, so that together you guys can grow that intimacy and then learn how to regain that trust with Him. I am Ciara Freeman, and I am trusted.